Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Today is December 3rd, 2018. Welcome to the Cluster API vSphere provider meeting. This is the biweekly syncup, and we're going to go ahead and start now. And if other people come, then great. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and send the link to the meeting notes on Zoom chat, and then if everybody can fill in all your information, attendee information initially, and then if there's, I put in a set of agenda, but if anybody else wants to bring up any other topic, go ahead and then add them. If you can, add them to right before the KubeCon 2018 session announcements, and then we'll proceed from there, okay? So first item on the agenda today is about the OVA build. Fabio did a great job. He got a PR in and we merged it in last week. It's now in the main repo. So I would suggest anybody who wants to try it to go ahead and give it a try. If you want to build it inside of Mac or Linux, you can type, go into the install subdirectory and do build/build.sh. And then the parameter I think you want is dev-ova, and then try it out yourself. Fabio, do you want to add anything to this?
No, the process is pretty much automatic. It requires a Docker running on your machine. So Docker for Mac, or if you have any Docker endpoint running, it will be enough to run the build. So the entire thing is built from a Docker container, so there's no special requirements on the host that is building. Once the build is complete, you see there's a new .ova file in the bin directory. You can just deploy that through the web interface, or use OVF tool or govc.
Okay.
It's there's no documentation right now. I'm working on a quick start document and more like architectural document for the OVA. I'll probably have that ready probably later this week. There's a few outstanding items I have to do before KubeCon next week, so
Yeah.
I'm just slipping.
Yeah.
Everything is like slipping away.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll have it ready before I head up to Seattle. So yeah,
I understand. I was scrambling this morning trying to update the my slides and working with Chris on our updates. So where do you think you're going to put the dock? Are you going to put it at the top level, or are you going to put it inside of the install subfolder?
I'm gonna keep everything under the installer, given that the OVA footprint is pretty big. There's a lot of code. There's a lot of supporting code. There's a lot of vendor code as well inside the directory. So I'm probably gonna keep everything under installer. So I'm gonna have installer/docs with a bunch of documentation in there, and probably have a README at the top level of the installer, and maybe link that from the main README. But yeah, I'm gonna try to keep everything separate, because it's like a kind of a separate body work, still related, but it's big enough that it requires its own some portion of repo.
Okay. Great. Let's move on to the next topic.
Sorry, Fabio, the question for the OVA, have we discussed about where to host those OVA? I mean, are we actually supporting that we produce the OVA and we host it somewhere?
Yeah. So I think the plan right now will be to have a build artifact. So the OVA right now is not necessarily tied to any change in the main repo. So meaning that there should really be a new OVA build. Let's call it like an OVA dev build every time there's a change on their installer. So if there's a change on their installer, then we can trigger off and build a new OVA, because all the changes are sourced from within that directory. So like, for example, if there's a PR that comes in and changes something on their package, like under the cluster API provider, there's no point in building another OVA, because there's nothing that has been changed in the OVA itself. That may change in the future, but right now it's like that. So I'm thinking that we definitely want to build an OVA whenever we tag a version in the repo. So whenever we create a new Git tag, we definitely need to have an OVA built and stored it somewhere. And we do have access to some Google Storage buckets, so it's not going to be a problem to figure out where to store it. Intermediate builds, like things like building a developer version of the OVA every time we have a change, landing on master that involves changing something under installer. That may be a very good idea, but we don't have a job for that yet, obviously. So we may want to think about doing something around that.
Okay. I discussed with you already. I actually like the installer kind of independent with the cluster API components. Means we, at least from the user standpoint of view, it's a clear isolation between the installer and the cluster API main components. I'm envisioning even in the future, if we do handle the cluster API CRD components installation by default, I think it's may still valuable to keep it very clear. So I think I feel that's going to help people in terms of debugging or understanding. Yeah, for the CI, for the reason I'm asking for the OVA artifacts, I think that we are going to do some work on the CI, and we're going to need that.
I think for now it's fine if we just start working like around, and this is up to you. You know much better Proud than I do. But if it makes sense to have a separate job for the OVA, that only gets triggered whenever there's a change that involves installer, or if it's better to have it as part of an existing CI job, that is up to you. In an ideal world, what I'd like to have is to have Proud recognize if the change set has changed something under a specific directory, and if it triggers that the threshold or that the specific trigger, it will kick off that specific job. I'm not sure if you can do that with Proud, but even if you don't, there's so many ways to do that, with scripts inside the job itself, like testing if the change set contains something that is changed under a specific directory and then kicking off the build. I've done something like that for a Vic in the past, to build off like everything that is under a specific directory only if there's a change in the change set that involves that directory. So shouldn't be too hard to like implement it, but it's up to you now how to make it happen.
Okay.
Do you know if that's possible?
I don't know whether that Proud can natively do that today.
Okay.
We may have to do something by ourselves if we want to do that.
Okay.
But we can have further discussion on this topic.
Okay. Okay. Is there any more comments or questions regarding the OVA today? If not,
I have a quick question. So is this OVA ever going to be used, let's say, for an end-to-end CI or some other testing purposes, for example? Or is this
Yes.
only a developer artifact that people who want to just use it can easily deploy and use it?
I can answer the CI part. We definitely want to integrate into the CI, and we are going to make it integrated into as soon as possible. I think before KubeCon.
So Siddharth, the idea here is that the OVA artifact is a way to have a running Kubernetes bootstrap cluster that we can target against, that we can target cluster CTL against it. So the idea is that the CI should use the OVA, should test the OVA, and should then use the OVA that has been built as a black box target, as a bootstrap cluster, to test the vSphere provider. So the idea is that we have an OVA, we have a vSphere environment, we deploy the OVA, we use that as bootstrap cluster, and then we run cluster cuddle against it, and we deploy on the target cluster, on the target infrastructure, which is the vSphere infrastructure. So the idea is that to use it, to build it, use it as a CI artifact, use it as part of the black box testing as end-to-end. So it serves many purposes, and it's also like something we'd like to see end users adopting if they're running on vSphere.
So I'll just add that yes, it is going to be used for some end-to-end tests, but it's not going to be the only method that we're going to use for testing. Right now, we're currently using. There exists a bootstrap cluster in the CI environment that we deploy the cluster API using cluster CTL, and I don't foresee us ever getting rid of that, because that is another method of deployment outside of the OVA. So the answer is yes, but the other question is whether this OVA will be executed, the build and the end-to-end testing will be executed on AVPR. That depends on how fast it is. And it might be that we only run this periodically. That's to be decided.
Right. I mean, so one other use that I can see is, like, since this is a OVA that gets created, this kind of serves as another mechanism to say, well, if you want to install and run cluster API with everything, so it comes with this operating system, this level of version of the Bootstrap Kubernetes cluster on top of the cluster API, and it kind of verifies or validates a particular combination, if you will. And if it's going to be used all throughout our testing, then the other side effect that we can, or the other artifact that we can kind of get out of it is, like, this is our support metrics, for example. This is what we test. So we have tested X version of this operating system with X version of the Bootstrap cluster with the top of the tree or a certain version of the cluster API to begin with in that combination too. And of course, the wider the test matrix we can generate, the better it is, but at least this serves as a starting point, I guess.
Yeah, and the OVA right now, it takes one parameter when you run the build, which is the Kubernetes version. Right now, by default, it takes a stable -1. But if you set the version, it will download that specific version, install that inside the OVA. So you can have a build with a matrix of different Kubernetes versions for that if we get to a point where we have to test against multiple versions.
Oh, that's actually very cool. Is there any? This is just a parameter that we give to the OVA, and then it uses kubeadmin to download that version, right?
Yep. So
you think that later on we can put it into like OVA UI, like a lot of like the stuff that we did for Vic?
Well, the entire OVA UI and all the other supporting components didn't really show any versions of component. I mean, they show a version of the cluster API OVA. The version of Kubernetes is defined when you build the OVA, and it's defined through that.
Okay, so it's hard. Okay.
So the version of the OVA is hard-coded at build time through the tag and the build number and the Git, hash ID. That is the cluster API. We're passing that through the Linger flags, and we build, the OVA UI and all the other components with that version. Kubernetes version, that is passed through the build scripts into kubeadm, and kubeadm pulls down the specific version, and also the specific version of the kubelet, and all the components, not just like kubeadm. So all the components that are bundled inside the OVA for Kubernetes, kubelet, kubeadm, and kubectl are downloaded with a specific version you pass to the build script.
Okay. So are there any other comments or questions related to the OVA? Okay, why don't we move on, okay? The next agenda item is that CI now runs on Prow, thanks to Hui's great effort last week. We have moved off of Travis CI, and all of the CI code is now, well, it will be in the main repo. There's a PR open right now. We're just waiting on Andrew to do one last quick look and then lift his hold.
By the way, Andrew has added the LGTM.
Oh, he did. Okay, then we'll because I chatted with him just before the meeting, and that wasn't the case.
Okay.
So I just realized I haven't been sharing my web browser while we've been talking. Okay, so great job, Hui. Do you want to add any other comments around this this topic?
Yeah, I probably have one or two follow-up PR regarding the CI code. One is we have to build cluster CTL separately and we probably have to hosting those cluster CTL binary in the GCR maybe, and and generating then dynamically in the CI job. This is one. Another is we need to also for the CI deployment we using a spec templates for machine spec, machine set, and clusters.
Yeah.
We want to generate those spec files also dynamically. I saw Siddharth actually opened a PR. I think these PR actually changed the machine spec, if I understand correctly. If this is the case, then the CI going to fail because the CI is based on a certain version of machine templates or machine spec.
Okay. Well, we can follow up with a PR that fixes that moves it to dynamic generation before we merge Siddharth PR.
Right. So I think those two need to be follow up immediately, and actually have the first one almost ready. So I'm waiting for the merge first, then I'll have the new PR.
Okay. I want to comment that the work that that Hui has done is just the beginning. Like he said, he has one or two follow-up PRs, but there's going to be more work done in addition to that. Currently, our end-to-end test is simply running cluster CTL create cluster. It just creates a one cluster, one master cluster, just a single machine. Hui, if that has changed, go ahead and correct me.
You are correct.
Okay. But we will want to create many different types of scenario. Hui and I talked about creating end-to-end or integration tests, however you want to name it, last week, about creating a matrix. So we can perform things like some ideas are like, for instance, the deployment configuration today, we just deploy a one master cluster. We don't create any machines or machine sets, and we need to add those other configuration to the CI. But Hui's PR needs to be merged in first before we can start working on that. So hopefully, starting sometime today or tomorrow, we're going to start working on adding more deployment configurations. Okay. Any other comments or questions regarding this PR? It's ready to be merged. We'll approve it and merge it right after this meeting. Okay. Let's move on. So there is one more upcoming PR to the repo. This is going to bring the vSphere provider repo up to date with the cluster API. There's been a couple of changes to the main cluster API repo in the last couple of weeks, and the PR that we merged in last week or the week before did not include those changes. Some of them are very small changes, but they had big implication to our code. Like, for instance, they renamed provider config to provider spec, and that actually caused a lot of issues in our main repo, in our vSphere provider repo's ability to build once we do a dep ensure. So Darth, do you want to make any other comments to this topic?
I think just like I just pasted the link onto the document itself, which is there. So PR 140, that basically adds that. One thing I noticed, like when we do a dep update, what I notice is, sorry, what I notice is like when you do dep ensure minus update, sometimes it's a bit flaky. I mean, maybe still need to probably root cause it further, like why it happens. But in the kind of change that I made to the go package.toml file, it once worked, then it didn't, and then I had to like clean it up, and then redo the change, and then it worked again. So this may be something to do with dep and maybe my local environment, but at least as far as I can say, right now it's okay. So I had to look at some of the other provider projects like GCP, OpenStack, and AWS, other ones, for like to look at what sort of dep dependencies, because I think I had to add like one dep dependency on Kubernetes 1.11.2 for the API machinery version, without which it doesn't work. And it's the same version that other projects are also at, but every project or every other provider has a slightly different way of expressing that. So it's not very consistent. And I think when Lock, you probably updated to move to CRD. Kube Builder originally added a couple of constraints which were like generated by Kube Builder, as Kube Builder tries to kind of own the Go package. So that was also causing some problems. So I had to kind of remove that. But at this, the current version of the PR, at least, I was able to build it properly and, fix some of those things. So hopefully the CI now, once it runs, can give us a little bit more confidence if anything else if I missed. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, with regards to Kube Builder, adding those constraints in the auto-generated section of the TOMO file, I this is going to be an interesting topic that we probably want to bring up in the main repo, right? If everybody's using a different version of KubeBuilder or a different version of packages, that might become a problem. We might want to sync up across all projects on the different packages used by all providers and the main repo. It will be a topic we'll bring up. Okay, that's great. Oh, one other thing I want to mention about dep ensure. I mentioned this to Siddharth earlier today, that I had so many problems with dep ensure inability to update that I have started, when I try dep ensure update first, I always do dep ensure update, and if that fails, I basically wipe out the lock file and delete the vendor folder and just do a clean dep ensure. I spent, I think, a day or two debugging a build issue because dep ensure update wasn't working. And as soon as I did those two steps of wiping out the lock file and the vendor folder, and then doing dep ensure from scratch, everything built fine. So I think there is some issues around dep ensure, and I don't really have the time to spend figuring out what it is that's causing dep ensure to do that. I just know that there is a process there that I follow that works every single time. Okay, so
thanks for that.
Yeah. So any more comments on this? We can move on to the next topic if no more comments or questions. Okay, let's talk about update on the ESXi provisioning. Fabio, do you think that, I know this is the week before KubeCon, you have your own sessions. What do you, and there might likely be some issues with the OVA that we might have to address. What do you think? Do you think that we can do this week, or should we just put this off until after KubeCon?
I think we should just put this off until after KubeCon. I don't think there's enough runway to get it done. Also because I need to rebase against all the changes that happen while I work on the OVA. There's probably some changes that might have pretty much, I would probably have to rebase it in a way that is going to take me a few days to get there. So, and yeah, let's put it off.
Okay, that's where I think everybody's fine with that. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next topic, update on vSphere testing. So I think that you guys may have seen we merged in a PR last week, or maybe at the end of the week before. I think it was last week. This was the start of the vSphere testing. Doug merged in a PR that added vSphere testing for the create path, and he's still working on the vSphere work is going to continue. It's going to continue past this quarter. There's some big ideas that he and I discussed about how we can use vSphere to test the cluster API, because around the topic of how do you simulate a cluster up and running, and that work, there's just not enough time this quarter to finish all of that. So there will be more work coming for vSphere testing, and Doug, I think he had to drop off to work on the Kubernetes 1.13 release. So yeah, we'll give an update the next time we have this meeting. Okay.
So could you give some hints? The simulator going to simulate both bootstrap cluster and the target cluster, right?
No, he doesn't actually. He's exercising the controller code directly. Okay, so he's not, and he's executing the actuator, the machine actuator. So he's not calling These are more like unit tests. So this is a unit test / functional test. So it's not going to take the place of the integration testing. That's not really what it's meant to do. So his code stands up a fake VC cluster and then calls the actuator code machine create function in the actuator to create a machine, and then verify that the machine was up and running using the simulator.
Okay, got you. Thank you.
Okay. So let's move on to E2E integration testing. So I think I mentioned earlier that we do have one E2E test, but it's very simplistic, and we just assume that if cluster CTL finishes, everything is fine. And that is the goal of the cluster API project, is that every call and every action is idempotent, and that it's transactional, but that's not the case right now. So I am working on a bunch of Ginkgo tests, and that I'm going to integrate into the work that Hui did for the CI on Prowl, so that we can verify that the cluster is actually deployed correctly. And then we're going to expand that matrix of end-to-end testing to do more configurations beyond just a one master cluster. So that work is currently ongoing. I have a whip on PR on GitHub. I would rather not get any comments on that PR, because this is my first time messing with Ginkgo, and I've laid it out in a way I think is reasonable. But if there's any comments or suggestions on how to improve that format, that layout of the testing, please let me know on Slack. What I mean by that is, like, some of the integration tests, for instance, verifies that we have a clean environment, or an environment that has cluster API deployed. And some of those can be run on both the Bootstrap cluster and the target cluster. And right now I'm thinking that the way that we determine which cluster to test with is through an environment variable. That's one of the topic that if anybody has an idea on a better way to do it, please let me know on Slack. I got a glimpse at the integration tests that our internal project uses for to test against, and I'm going to take a look at that a little bit to see how they structured their testing, and I might pick up some ideas and then add it to our Ginkgo tests. So any comments or questions related to that? Okay, then let's move on. Hui, why don't we move your issue up? And I want to talk about the KubeCon loss. So
Sure.
I'm going to go ahead and move it up. And why don't you talk about this?
Yes, I filed an issue while debugging the CI, and this issue, I think it's I haven't looked at the code carefully, but I believe it's an issue, and it's not easy to reproduce. So when it's happened, it's so the target VM, the target cluster VM is being cloned, but the controller, I think the controller keep reclone this VM, but since the VM is already there and it's correct, so it's going to be trying to reclone this with the same VM name, and the reclone will be failed definitely, and it's keep doing that every 5 seconds, I believe. and it's stuck in that loop. So I believe there are some race condition or the synchronization problem there that the clone is success, but it's not getting the updates, and still think the original clone maybe it's failed, it's not returned correctly, and it keeps retrying. So
go ahead.
So I think this is I need to assign this issue to myself right now. But if someone like got a little bit of time and you know what's the problem, you can go ahead and fix it. Otherwise, I think it should be some issue there.
So we've seen this issue before, and we fixed it for around the issues that we've seen in the past. And I can tell you why it's doing that. I can't tell you specifically for the issue that you saw, but so the way that we're doing the machine actuator create is a little bit different than, this is a topic that's up for debate. And Siddharth and I talked about it. We talked about it in the main cluster API working group meeting. And there's really no agreement on the way that it should be called. But the way that the main controller, if it doesn't detect that the machines has been created, we'll call the actuator machine that create. And the way that we're doing the machine that create is that we're using it as like an entry for a state machine, and we're relying on the fact that the cluster, the machine controller will continue to reschedule a call to create if it doesn't succeed the first time. So let's say that there's 5 steps to the create process. The first time it goes through and it does step 1 and it sees that it's not fully created, it will reschedule the create again. And then the next time the controller will see that, okay, now call the create machine actuator create again, and then machine actuator will see that, okay, we finished step 1, let's move to step 2. And that's why you're seeing this thing over and over, the clone process over and over.
I think I think the general symptom is what you defined lock is probably right, but there is definitely subtle difference, a reason why it happens, because I've seen that happen in my environment. And I can tell you one of the reasons why it may happen, for example, in our state machine, one of the things, for example, the actuator does is whenever it tries to start cloning the template, it basically updates the machine object with the task reference, so that the next time iteration, whenever it comes back, it can actually look at that and monitor it. Now there could be the situation where I have at least seen this fail is when, so there is a time between, for example, the task gets completed and that particular task gets taken off from so the task reference is removed, and the machine ID, which is the actual motive of the machine, is getting put on to the machine object. And at this stage, to the create is complete is, I think there's probably one more thing. Now, if the controller for any reason were to be interrupted in between, wherein while it was in the transition phase of taking off the task ID and then annotating with the machine ID, and if that stage, if it basically was killed or whatever, like it was interrupted in between, then what would happen is now on the vSphere side, you actually have that created, but now the subsequent calls will think that nothing has been created because the spec doesn't reflect that, and then it will basically keep retrying, and then that's where the problem is. But I think,
I think, Siddharth, your explanation looks reasonable to this issue, looks like. If that is the case, can we have a log for that to make sure?
So, right, so essentially the log, so one of the things we can probably double check. So in case if we do get to reproduce that, I mean, it will be good to gather logs. My suspicion is for instance, you would have noticed that in the logs as well. Sometimes when you're updating an object, if that object version was changed somewhere else by some other process, then the Kubernetes API rejects that change and says that please update your object and then try and update again, right? I mean, I'm sure you would have seen that in the log somewhere. Now, if something similar were to happen at the time when the actuator was updating, let's say, the machine ID, and its changes were rejected, I think that's where we probably need to add some more special handling in our code, which might probably solve that problem. But I think I've seen that symptom before, so I have some idea where we could potentially fix it. Let me try and maybe go through the process one more time and identify what potential areas where it might help. And in the meanwhile, if you are able to figure out maybe like a specific reproduction steps, that will be really fantastic. Okay, that will help us validate it pretty much quickly.
So I want to bring up the topic of time. Okay, so we really only have 4.5 days. And at this point, Hui, if you say that it is hard to reproduce, I think I think that right now the CI, the testing, and anything to do with any issues around the OVA has to take priority. And perhaps if we can just offload that to Siddharth if he has time, that would be a better use of our time.
Yeah, I definitely don't have time before KubeCon to really analyze this code. But if Siddharth can take on this, that would be great.
And Siddharth, we're not expecting, if this issue is hard to reproduce, and I can do a one recording that doesn't have it fail, then I think that I would be set for KubeCon. But I know that you're busy with your project, so if you have time to look at this, we would appreciate it. But you tell us whether you have time for it.
Well, I mean, I think so. I don't think I'll be able to devote some time to debug just this, like in the next couple of days or so. But I think maybe, unless it's something which we reproduce pretty frequently, which I don't think it is the case. Therefore, I can treat this as like as a corner case somewhere where we are not capturing certain cases. We can definitely try. I mean, I'll try and get to this maybe in a week or two time. Hopefully that should be okay.
So let me ask Locke, are you going to do any live demo on stage?
Given the time it takes to deploy a OVA, I'm thinking about this. I will want to have a demo recording in my pocket, okay, in case the network is bad there, or it takes forever to deploy the OVA. And without the ESX provisioning, we had to deploy on VC, which means that the deployment will be over wide area network to my cluster that's under my desk, or over to Nimbus or one of our other systems. So what I might do is do a recording for the OVA part, deployment part, and then do a live demo of using it. But I will also do a recording of that part also, just to have it in my back pocket.
Yeah, if you plan to do a live demo, I think you still have the chance of seeing this problem.
Oh, I see.
Because this, I believe this is a small race window there that if you hit it, it will be bad. Basically, it's keep recloning for forever.
So one thing I can say is, I mean, it's not exactly like a race condition within the normal workflow, but it is a case where, as I said, if the process gets, let's say something were to restart the controller, in between while it is making some progress somewhere, then there is a chance. But in general, I mean, because I've been using the same top of the tree cluster API for some time, I mean, I don't see that very often. I mean, the only time when I see is when I'm actually manually fiddling with the cluster API, changing and restarting things like that. Then that's the time when I usually see this. So, I mean, I don't think this is like a very frequently reproducible thing. So maybe it's okay, but yeah, there's always a chance. But,
yeah, it's not frequent, but there's a chance.
Yeah, I understand the situation. Like I said, we at this point in time, we just have to prioritize. I will try to get a recording done, and if I get a good recording, I may just provide a link or play that recording at KubeCon. Because I've looked at this issue around this before, and it takes time. It takes time to debug it, and then to find a fix. And given our priorities leading up to KubeCon, you know, it concerns me, this issue, but not getting the other work done on time concerns me more than this issue. And I will spend some time leading up to the presentation. If Siddharth doesn't get to it, I will keep looking at it leading up to the presentation, because you know, I have Saturday and then Sunday I travel up there, and then Monday and Tuesday to work on it. My presentation doesn't happen until Wednesday. Okay. So speaking of KubeCon, let's discuss our last topic and then we'll call it a day. So KubeCon 2018, there's a bunch of sessions related to cluster API and cluster lifecycles. I have listed them here. The first one is the one that VMware is doing, so I listed that first. And the title is Use the Cluster API to Deploy Cluster On-Prem and in Public Clouds. And I am doing that with Chris Nova from Heptio. It's on, I believe, on Wednesday. Let me bring up my calendar. Oh, I'm sorry. It's on Tuesday, December 11th, 3:40 to 4:15. I think this one is going to be the most interesting presentation for non-developers. We have a couple other sessions following that are more targeted to people who want to get involved in cluster API or who want to assist in helping with the providers. So the next one is the Intro to Cluster Lifecycle SIG. Robert Bailey from Google and Tim St. Clair from Heptio are doing that. It's also on the same day, earlier in the day, 11:40 to 12:15. The next one is a deep dive, Cluster Lifecycle SIG, and this is going to be on kubeadm. And Tim St. Clair from Heptio and Liz Frost from Heptio, they're doing it on Thursday, December 13th, 1:45 to 2:20 p.m. The fourth one is a deep dive, Cluster Lifecycle SIG, and this one will be on the Cluster API. And this one will be done by Robert Bailey from Google and David Watson from Samsung. And the last one, the fifth one, this one is, I think some of our guys on CNX would be interested in going to. It doesn't have to deal with Cluster API, but there is going to be, it has importance to Cluster API. This one is, you can't have a cluster leap without a cluster. This gets into why Cluster API has to bring up that bootstrap cluster to create the target cluster. But I think her presentation is going to be more generic, but it's going to touch on this topic. And that is Thursday, December 13th, 1:45 to 2:20 p.m. So for anybody in this call who are going to KubeCon, or anybody who watches this video once it's we post it on YouTube, and who's going to KubeCon, please attend one of these meetings and then listen to our presentation on Cluster API. Okay. If there aren't any more questions or topics that we need to discuss, I think we are done. Going once, going twice. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for this week's bi-weekly Cluster API vSphere Provider syncup. We'll see you guys again after KubeCon, the week after KubeCon. And see you guys at KubeCon.
Bye, folks.
Bye, guys.
Thanks.